Okay, class. This is going to be a lecture video on chapter 4 in your textbook. The link to the textbook is provided in the syllabus. As I mentioned in my introductory email to you all, I'm going through a bit of a terrible time now, and this is what has led to me canceling courses. I'm hoping to come back into class as soon as possible, but unfortunately, I'm a little bit in the unknown. This is a relatively new infection, and I have to see how things play out with the medicine they have me on. So I don't anticipate this happening for more than a week additionally, or 2 at the most, but I don't want to make a promise I can't keep. So I will do my best to keep you up to date with lecture videos at a minimum. All right. So this chapter is going to focus on a very, very important market in economics, and that is the labor market. And the market is where goods and services, or buyers and sellers, are exchanged or exchange goods and services. So for instance, if you're somebody who owns a store that sells juice drinks, then you are a supplier in the market, and the people who are thirsty that would like to take a drink are, demanders in the market. So for the labor market, the suppliers are workers. They're supplying their labor, and the demanders are all the businesses in the economy that have a need for specific types of workers. So they meet together in the market for labor, and hopefully when a person gets a job, they've supplied their labor and someone else has found it worthy for them to get paid for that labor. And that's how a job is created, essentially. All right, so that's just a bit of a preview here. So we're going to look at the demand and supply in the labor market, and we're also going to be looking at a snippet of the financial market as well. We're going to apply this supply and demand model to both of these markets. And we're not really going to talk about section 4.3, as that is more of a Econ 101 topic, but we're going to focus on both of these sections in the chapter, right? So each chapter in your textbook, if you go through it, you'll see it starts off with an example. And so here is the one type of labor we're going to focus on is that of nursing. And so here you've got, looks like a nurse or a doctor providing services to somebody who demands those services, in this case, a patient. And here are a couple of definitions. I'm not sure you've heard from other students who have taken my class before, but I am a pretty big advocate of going over vocabulary words. You'll be tested on those. Every exam has a big section on vocabulary words. And so in your textbook, they are bolded, and I expect you to know what every single one of these words means. So the labor market is essentially a market which includes the demand and supply for labor. Again, who supplies labor? It's workers. And who demands labor? It's businesses and firms that have a need to hire somebody to help them out, right? The law of demand and the law of supply, these are hopefully intuitive to you, and that is, if somebody wants to get a higher salary or a wage to work for you, you're not going to be as happy about that because it costs more money. Likewise, if someone comes to you and wants to do a really, really good job, or you know that they can do a really, really good job, and they don't really have this high demand for a high salary, you're going to be more inclined to hire them. And that's essentially the law of demand in practice, and that's higher salary or wages in the labor market results in a decrease in the quantity of labor demanded by employers. And vice versa, a lower salary or wage will actually end up increasing the quantity of labor demanded. And the law of supply is, now you're going to take the perspective of the employee, and that is, well, if you can actually earn a higher wage for your labor, you're going to be more likely to want to supply your labor to that company or that industry or that economy, okay? If it is a lower price for labor, you're going to be less inclined to want to supply your labor there. If it's low enough, you might even take it upon yourself to immigrate to another country, all right? And equilibrium is essentially where the law of demand and the law of supply sort of coexist together. In other words, the quantity of labor demanded is equal to the quantity of labor supplied, and there's a specific price at which that happens. All right. Here is an example for the market for nurses, and you can see here we have a demand curve that is downward sloping, and we have a supply curve that is upward sloping, and that is consistent with the law of demand and law of supply. So, and then here on the x-axis, we have the quantity of nurses supplied and the quantity of nurses demanded. And on the y-axis, we have the price for those nurses, which is their salaries. Okay. And if we just want to focus on the demand curve here, so let me see if I can highlight this. So here, the demand curve, you can see that just like the law of demand says, if there's higher wages or higher prices for labor, there's going to be less of a demand. So as the price or wage goes up, the quantity of labor goes to the left, right? It's a negative relationship between prices and quantities demanded, right? Now that is not the case with the supply curve, right? Here's the supply curve. It's upward sloping. We can see that with the supply curve, that at lower wage, let's say at 70,000, you get a quantity supplied of. Let me see if I can actually write that in for you all. So let's see. So here, at let's say $70,000 of a wage offered, we're going to draw the line there, and then we can go down here. And this tells us what the supply of nurses will be if the wage is at 70,000. All right, looks like it's around 27,000 nurses. All right. If the wage, however, it goes up to 90,000, you're going to see a lot of nurses are going to be happy about that, or they're going to want to work there, and they're going to supply their labor. And you can see that this curve here, essentially moved, that value increased. It went from 27,000 or so up to around 45,000. Right, and that's the law of demand and supply, and like we defined with the equilibrium, they are balanced at a single point here, and that is right over here at this E, where X marks the spot. You can see that that's an equilibrium wage of around 85,000, and at 85,000 a year, you get around 42, 41,000 nurses wanting to supply their nursing services, and you get 41 to 42,000 hospitals that want to hire those nurses as well. So this is the important concept here of the equilibrium. It happens right at this point here, and that is the equilibrium price, the wage, let's say 85,000, and this is the equilibrium quantity here, 42,000 or so. All right. If we have a wage that's higher than the equilibrium or lower than the equilibrium, we're going to get excess demand or excess supply of labor. So here at an equilibrium wage of 90,000, you can see that this is what the demand for nurses is, but the supply of nurses is way over here. There are nurses that would like to supply their labor, but there are not jobs available for them to supply to. Likewise, if the wage goes below 80,000, let's say here to 75, you can see that there's an excess demand or a shortage of nurses. In that case, at 75,000, you can see that this is the supply of nurses here, but the quantity of nurses is all the way here to the right. So these two are not equal to each other. All right, and this is excess demand. Demand here is greater than supply, and that is a result of that results in a shortage. And that's the opposite case where the price goes above the equilibrium. Here you've got a supply way over here, a demand over here. There is more supply than there are jobs available for nurses. Right? Only at this point here at the equilibrium are both of those, the demand and supply, satisfied. And at this point, there is there's no real reason for the equilibrium to move away from it once it reaches that point there. So what could cause a shift of the demand curve? So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different things that can shift the demand curve for labor. So here is the demand for output. And what you'll see is that if there's an increase in the demand, let's stick with the example of nurses. Let's say if there's more sick people that go to the hospital, so they want more output from the hospital, which is medical services. And if there's an increase in the demand for that, those hospitals are going to have to hire more nurses, and that's going to shift the demand curve for output to the right. All right, if you've got nurses that have a high education and high level of training, a lot of experience, versus nurses that have a low education and low level of training, if everything else is no different, then the nurses with the higher education and the higher training, they're going to have a higher level of demand. So an increase in education and training is going to result in a rightward shift in the demand curve, or a shifting of the demand curve. Increases in technology also result in a rightward shift of the demand curve. So increases in technology will make nurses more productive. And if nurses are more productive, that means that the hospital can sell more of their services for the same amount of time, right? They're just an increase in productivity. And so for those nurses, or if there's an increase in technology overall in nursing, you're going to see that there's going to be an increase in the demand for nurses. Again, because hospitals are going to be able to make more nursing or medical services per unit of time than they were before. Now, this is a double-edged sword. This is assuming that the jobs of nurses aren't replaced. Right? This can backfire. If the technology is there as automation, let's say to replace a nurse with a robot, for instance, that's a totally different type of technology, then that would actually have the opposite effect. It would decrease the demand for nurses. But for the most part, we're going to consider the types of technologies will actually make nurses more productive and increase their demand for all wages, at all wages. Number of companies, and again, if we're sticking with the nursing example, that would be like the number of hospitals. If you open more hospitals, you're going to have an increase in the demand for nurses, obviously. And there could be government regulations. Let's say, for example, if there's a requirement that specific number of nurses per patient goes up, well, then that's going to also artificially increase the demand for nurses. If the law is relaxed and the demand for nurses goes down, then that's going to shift the demand curve for nurses to the left, right? So depending on what this government regulation says, you've got to look at it and go, is this something that sounds like it's going to put pressure on hiring more nurses, or is it going to, let's say, not really motivate an increase in the hiring of nurses? And then obviously the price and availability of other inputs. If the cost of medicine goes up, that could impact the demand for nurses, because if the cost of medicine goes up, that means the price of healthcare goes up, and people might not be able to afford as much healthcare, so there's less of a demand for nurses. So this is always the interesting case where you look at nursing as one type of input into medical services, and if the price of those other inputs goes up, it actually impacts the price of the entire bundle of medical care, right? And that's going to have an indirect impact on the demand for nursing. Let's look at factors that shift the supply curve of labor. Here we have obviously the number of workers. If you've got more nurses entering into the marketplace, that's obviously going to shift the supply curve for labor to the right. If you've got, let's say, an increase in required levels of education, let's say, for example, if it's the nursing field and you require nurses to have a master's degree now in order to work, not all of them are going to qualify. So, you might see a decrease in the supply offered. In other words, not as many nurses are going to be able to take those jobs because they don't have the required education. So the supply of qualified nurses is going to fall. And here again, government policies is also something, depending on the policy in mind that we have, that could affect the supply of nurses or the supply for labor in general, right? So again, we're using the example of nurses because that's the example that the chapter started off with, but this applies to any type of labor as well. Okay, so let's look at an example here after all that. So let's see, we've got, how will new technologies affect the wages of high-skilled and low-skilled workers? So here is a bit of it's a very good question, right? So we've got high-skilled versus low-skilled workers, and we have new technologies, all right? So this is going to be one of these scenarios where the technology might benefit the high-skilled workers, but the technology might actually offset or replace the low-skilled workers. So this is what this textbook example is going to look at. So let's take a look and see what that does to our market for high and low-skilled labor. So here you can see on the left we've got the low-skilled labor, and on the right we have the marketplace for high-skilled labor. So here technology is one of these things that's going to shift the demand curve for high-skilled labor to the right. And why? Because usually high-skilled labor is the type of labor that is increased, or the productivity of that labor is increased when there are technological innovations. All right. So think of like a computer scientist. Think about a manager. Think about an accountant who now they have newer technologies that makes them more productive, and that's going to increase the demand for that type of labor. Here, low-skilled labor, you want to think of things like janitors or someone who does some cleaning. Perfect example of this, anyone who ever been to Stop and Shop in Providence, you might have noticed that there's a robot now that sometimes goes around and cleans the floor. Or you can have, even in your own dorm room, you might have a Roomba. All right, that's a technology that has replaced someone who does low-skilled labor, let's say cleaning, and you could see that that would shift the demand for labor to the left. Now, if the supply curve doesn't move, and it won't because we didn't really talk about anything that would shift the supply curve, you can see that when you've got a demand curve that shifts to the right, the wage ends up going up. High-skilled labor that's hired ends up increasing, so there are more jobs created here. But look at what happens to the low-skilled labor. The demand curve shifts to the left, their wages go down, and you get less of those people employed. All right, so they're totally different impacts of something like technology on, let's say, for example, low-skilled labor versus high-skilled labor. So this is a really great example, and I encourage you to go over it in your textbook as well. Okay, so here are a couple of policies. So let's start here with the minimum wage, and that's something called a price floor that makes it illegal for an employer to pay employees less than a certain hourly wage. All right, so the minimum wage in Rhode Island, I think it's pretty high. I want to say it's like 14 or 15 bucks. I don't remember, but you cannot hire anyone legally under and pay them lower than what the minimum wage is. So this is a policy that's put in place to try to help people earn what's called a living wage. And a living wage is the amount a full-time worker would need to afford the essentials of life, including food, clothing, shelter, and health care. And obviously, depending on what part of the country we're talking about, this living wage is going to be high or it's going to be low. We could also talk about the average living wage for the entire country, and it'll probably take the average prices of food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare, average amount, and that'll tell you what the wage is for someone to, have a decent living, right? And then again, the salary or the wage, by definition, is the money that is paid for work or a service, right? And again, folks, you've got 3 vocabulary words here. I'd like you to memorize them. Students in the past have had success by just creating flashcards and just writing the vocabulary words as they read through the textbook. All right, and I encourage you to do the same. So here's an example of a price floor, and so let's go over this example. The original equilibrium in this labor market is around $10 an hour here. All right, you can see here $10 an hour, and you've got about 1,200 workers that are hired at $10 an hour. But let's say, for example, there's a price floor at $12, meaning you're not allowed. So I'm going to do my best to write legibly here, but this might not end well. Oh, I knew it wasn't going to end well. Trying to write with my mouse. So that's the price floor, meaning the price cannot go below this, right? This is the lowest the price can go, or the lowest that this is the lowest that the wage can go. And what you're going to see is what that results is in you've got this many people that want to work right here, 1,600, right? But you only have this many jobs available at $12 an hour, which is over here. And there's only 700 jobs available. So how many people are out of luck? 1,600 minus 700 is what, 900? So there are 900 extra people that want to work. They want to supply their labor at $12 an hour, but there aren't enough jobs available to them. So that's excess supply, or like we said, that would be a surplus of labor. All right. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit to the financial markets. All right. So here we're going to apply the similar type of supply and demand model to the financial market. And the financial market is where savers and borrowers now are getting together and exchanging something called financial capital. All right. So financial capital is defined as economic resources measured in terms of money. And if you're somebody who has a lot of savings, you've got a great supply or a large supply of financial capital. And if you're somebody who does a lot of borrowing, you're somebody who has a demand for financial capital. So you can see here in the financial market, that's where savers and borrowers actually get together to try to exchange financial capital. All right. And the price in this market is the interest rate. So that is the price of borrowing in the financial market, is also known as the rate of return on an investment for the similar type of reasoning. And then usury laws. This is, something that doesn't really occur nowadays, but other outside of credit cards, and I'll explain that shortly. But these are laws that impose an upper limit or a ceiling on the interest rates that lenders can charge, right? So here is an example of the supply and demand for financial capital, and we're going to use the framework of credit cards here as a way to try to illustrate that. So someone who uses a credit card is somebody who's borrowing money. They are a demander of financial capital. The credit card company, or the bank that is issuing the credit card, that is a supplier of financial capital. And you can see here on the left, we've got all kinds of prices for that financial capital. These are interest rates. All right, and depending on the supply and demand, you can see here, this is where the intersection is. It occurs at an interest rate of 15%. So at 15%, you see that there is $600 billion both lent out and borrowed. All right, that's the equilibrium where both of those are equal. Now, if the interest rate is really high, let's say it goes up to, let's say that interest rate goes up to, where's my pen here? 21%, right? You can see that this ends up being the demand, right? That distance there is the demand here, right? From here to here, whatever that quantity is, it looks like it's 0 to, I would say, somewhere around 450 maybe. So 450 billion, if the interest rate's that high, not many people are going to want to borrow at that high interest rate. But you're going to get a lot of credit card companies that would love to lend money at 21%. In other words, here, this is the supply right over here. All right. So this is an excess supply or surplus of credit. All right. Now, if interest rates go down, let's say to 13% here, all right, we could see that this ends up being the supply, but a lot of people want to borrow. That's the demand, right? And you can see that there is an increase in the demand as we go down the interest rates. If they go down, you see that we move down this demand curve, but we're moving down and to the right. Okay, and that's excess demand, right? You've got a lot of people that want to borrow, but there's not enough capital to satisfy all their needs. So that is going to result in pressure on the interest rate to go up. You want to think of like an auction, let's say online, where if there's a collectible item that everybody's bidding on, what happens to the price of that collectible item? As the bids come in, the price of that collectible item starts to increase, right? And if somebody has a reserve price for an item that's too high, okay, well, what happens on an online marketplace if they're expecting to make, or expecting to sell something for a lot of money, more than what somebody wants to to buy it for, well, you're going to see that eventually they're going to get the picture that they're not selling this item and they're going to have to start lowering the price, right? So these are the forces that bring about an equilibrium. Is if you've got a surplus, it puts pressure on the price to go down, and if you have a shortage, it puts pressure on prices to go up, okay? Think about a price of a bottle of water in the middle of a natural disaster, right? That's a pretty big demand for something like that, and people are going to they're going to be willing to pay an astronomical amount of money for that, right? If you remember what happened during COVID and let's say hand sanitizer, right? There was a huge push for that. There was definitely excess demand or shortage of that stuff here. Okay. All right, so here I think this is going to go over what I just described. So we don't really need to focus too much on this slide. But yeah, just keep it in mind that here you can see that there's a bit more of an explanation in the last slide. So this is a below equilibrium interest rate. You get excess demand or a shortage of capital. If the interest rate is too high, then you end up with an extra supply or a surplus of that financial capital. So here, let's say that there is a price ceiling. So this would be an example of a usury law. So this would be like the government comes in and says that the credit card companies are not allowed to charge an interest rate above, let's say, 20%. Okay, so this could be here, this value here, this could be like, let's say, 20%, right? That's the most that the company is going to be able to charge. But the equilibrium is higher. This can be something like 22%, right? But if the credit card companies are not allowed to charge above this ceiling, right? You can see that puts pressure on the price to want to go up or the interest rate to want to go up. But with that ceiling in place, it's not allowed to go up, okay? And what you end up with is you get a lot of people that want to borrow money at low interest rates, but there's not enough money to go around. So that creates this excess demand or shortage for credit when there's a ceiling that is below the equilibrium. So why do people save? Right, and that goes about these two vocabulary words here. One is the intertemporal decision making. So you got to figure out whether or not you're going to consume or save things, consume goods now or in the future, or save money for now a purchase or save money for the future. Right, and that's when we say intertemporal, that means you're going across time. Right, and here's another discussion question: what are some examples of intertemporal decision making? So it could be something like, let's say, for example, someone who wants to save for retirement. That is someone who's taking action now for an event that's going to happen in the future. You could have somebody who's saving up money to buy a car in the future, somebody who's saving up for a house. Any one of those decisions that motivates people to save so that they can make a purchase in the future. I mean, they might not be able to afford it now, but they're saving up they have a goal in mind and they want to make that purchase. All right. So these are what we mean by that. And I'd like you to maybe think about what could be some other examples of intertemporal decision making. It could be something like saving up to buy your first car. There's plenty of examples of that you can hopefully think of. Okay, so here is an example of what would happen to the interest rate or the rate of return and the quantity of financial capital if there's an increase in the growing of U.S. debt. Right? So the growing of U.S. debt means that the debt of the country is increasing. And what usually happens is when someone borrows a lot of money for you, they have a bit of a harder time borrowing from other places because other places are going to realize they've borrowed a lot of money and they might not get paid back. So what you can see here is that if there is an increase in U.S. debt, that might not look good to a foreigner who might be willing to lend money to the United States. And what we can see is that shows up in a decrease in the supply of financial capital to the United States, and with the result of the interest rate has to go up. Okay, the United States has this need to borrow, but if there is too much debt, they're not going to see as much savings come in to the country, and that's going to put pressure on interest rates to rise. So if the United States wants to borrow more money, they're going to have to borrow at a higher interest rate. All right. And this is a pretty good summary of what happens, not just in the United States, but other countries. If they have a high level of debt, you tend to see interest rates on the borrowing and saving to those countries start to rise. Okay, so just a summary for demand and supply models in general. So again, on any demand and supply model, the horizontal axis shows the different measures of quantity, all right, of either a good or a service, labor for a given job, or financial capital. And the vertical axis usually shows the price of that good or service, the price of labor, which is the wage, as we talked about, and the price of financial capital, which is the rate of return, like the interest rate. Usually what we can see is that when prices change and quantities bought and sold change, that reflects consumer, producers, and laborers' behavior, and it sort of manifests themselves in changes in the equilibrium. If we impose price controls, however, that might skew the results of the supply and demand model for labor, for goods and services, or a financial market, depending on what type of price control we're talking about. And price controls refer to price ceilings, and they refer to price floors, as we saw in a couple of the examples we did. All right. Now, that information is very, very important as far as, hey, if the price of something went up recently, it must mean that either there's an increase in the demand for it, so I better buy it now before the price goes up higher, or there's also a decrease in the supply of it, which also might motivate somebody to buy something now because if the price goes up, it means that there's a shortage. Likewise, it works in the opposite direction. If the price goes down of an item, it could mean that there's less of a demand or there's more of a supply. Something that results in a surplus would create a situation where the price of something goes down. So you can see this is important information. So if we kind of blur that information with price controls, it becomes difficult for buyers and sellers to make those intertemporal decisions and react as these changes spill through our economy. Let me take a look here. So, okay. So here is a good example here from your textbook. And this is the demand for nurses as the baby boomers come of age. Baby boomers are that group of babies that was born post-World War II. They're now old people. And so you can see that that's kind of a shock to the system where all of a sudden there's a lot of older people around. And older people tend to need more medical services than younger people do. All right, so baby boomers come of age. What's going to happen? Those people want medical services. So they're going to need to go to the hospital. They might need to go to, I guess, what is it called? Convalescent hospitals. And all of that plays a role in shifting the demand for nurses to the right because there's an increase in the demand for output. What's the output here? Medical services. All right. And we can see that with this increase in the number of older individuals, this increase in baby boomers, what ends up happening is the equilibrium price or the salary for nurses is going to go up. And you can see that there's going to be way more nurses hired. All right. And so in 2020, the median salary for nurses was $75,330. And we can see that as a result, by now in 2025, that wage is going to be a lot higher as a result of the baby boomers getting older and older. And here we can see that because of COVID, maybe there was a decrease in the supply as well. So these can have two impacts at the same time. So you've got the baby boomers getting older, which shifts the demand curve to the right. That, would shift the equilibrium price up from E0 to E1. But what happens at the same time if there's a leftward shift in the supply of nurses because they don't want to work in a hospital anymore for fear of coming down with COVID, let's say, for example? Well, if that supply curve shifts to the left, then you're not going to stay here at E1. You're also going to go up to E2. So you're going to make this zigzag pattern. So here you see that the price doesn't just go up to PE1. It goes up to the equilibrium or the equilibrium wage 2. Right? There's like a boost there because there was two impacts. One impact was the demand curve shifted to the right. The other impact was that the supply curve also shifted to the left. It creates like a double shortage. Right? There's like a double shortage of nurses. and the wage for nurses is going to go way up as a result of that. All right. Okay. Hopefully you made it to the end of this video, and I didn't put you to sleep. I'm going to upload this now, and it should be available on a YouTube page, and I'll send a link out through email as soon as that's available. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on email, and I will reply to your questions as soon as possible. All right, thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.